As SOS Humanity, with our rescue vessel Humanity One, we are operating in the central Mediterranean Sea. It's the big sea area basically between the south of Italy, Tunisia and Libya, this triangle mainly. On that route, we see that a lot of people on the move, mainly from Libya, also from Tunisia, are trying to escape from their countries of origins. There is still a big number of people using Tunisia and Libya as departure places for crossing to Europe, because there are no legal ways for those people to escape their situations in their home countries. I would say actually that the number of people who are actually coming from Tunisia or from Libya is very, very small. It's just a very, very tiny number. The vast majority of people, I would say there are 3 different regions. So on the one hand, this is African countries in sub-Saharan Africa. On the one hand, we have Western African countries, for example, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Gambia, Senegal, Nigeria, but also on the eastern part of Africa, especially Somalia and Eritrea at the moment, are countries where people are fleeing from in big numbers. But then there was, and I think this is a number that went a little bit down in the last months, is the number of people from Syria, but especially at the beginning of the last year, that was, made a big part. And then the third region where a lot of people we rescue are coming from is our Asian countries in the region of Pakistan and Bangladesh. But I think it also must be said that the ways people make it to Libya and Tunisia are very, very differently. While from African countries, people mainly travel over the land, the very, very dangerous landway through the Sahara. The organization of migration from countries such as Bangladesh or Pakistan or even Syria usually works quite different. People get attracted by traffickers, by smugglers from Libya, often to work there, to get labor there. And upon arrival, then we hear reports that they're getting exploited, they're getting taken away their passports, and they're forced to work, often without any monetary compensation, under terrible conditions, and for them then often the only way to leave the country again is via this dangerous path over the Mediterranean. So the Central Mediterranean Sea is still one of the most dangerous migration routes.
Mi función en este momento es coordinador de búsqueda y rescate. Estoy ahora a bordo de uno de los dos barcos que forman la flota de la organización, que es el velero Astral, el primero de ellos con el que empezamos a hacer misiones en el Mediterráneo Central. El Astral opera un poco más al norte y se enfoca más en la ruta tunecina y, digamos, los barcos o los botes que puedan llegar más hacia el norte, dentro de lo que es la zona de búsqueda y rescate maltesa o tunecina o italiana, y el Open Arms se enfoca más al sur, más cerca de las costas de Libia.
We have families who are doing this route. We also have a big number of minors. This is something that really stands out. Almost a third of all people we rescue at sea are minors. Then, of course, we also have adult male, but we also have very young people, like really young children, who are doing this the route with their families, with their mothers. Sometimes even people in very, very young ages traveling alone. We also have elderly people, basically all different kinds, all different ages, all different gender of people. And that really also highlights what a terrible condition the people must be, and how terrible the condition in their home countries, but also in Libya and Tunisia, is for the people, that no matter in which personal situation they are, no matter in which vulnerability they are, they see themselves forced to make this dangerous crossing where they are risking their lives.
Cualquier mujer que está tratando de cruzar ya de por sí lo tiene muchísimo más difícil. Todas las personas que hacen el viaje, sobre todo, aparte han tenido que cruzar el desierto, han sido expuestos o han sufrido vulneraciones de sus derechos de todo tipo, han caído en redes de tráfico de gente, han sido torturados para extorsionar a sus familias, para conseguir dinero. A veces, por cómo es la escena, el contexto político hoy, cuando aparece una embarcación de guardacostas libios, la gente incluso prefiere tirarse al agua y correr el riesgo de ahogarse. a que sean interceptados o embarcados en las patrulleras libias y que sean devueltos a Libia, ¿no? Y otra vez expuestos a todo esto.
People in the boat varies a lot on the boat type. Rubber boats often can be quite big, up to 100 people. Wooden boats also can be quite big, more than 100 people, especially if they are double-decker wooden boats, where there are also not only people on like visible on the upper deck, but also lower deck where a lot of people are crammed together. All the boats we see are highly overcrowded and in a very dangerous situation, often at immediate risk of capsizing. With no means to navigate, with no means to save people if anything happens. If a boat capsizes, for example, there's no life-saving equipment on board. These boats are always immediate distress cases.
When we started 2015, 16, it was a very different way to operate because there was a very close cooperation with European Union states, especially with Italy. It was also very common that NGOs were informed by state MRCCs or rescue and coordination centers, because if you look at the Mediterranean, it's basically divided into different search and rescue zones. And this means it's a zone that is basically connected to a state. So in our case, there is on the European side a Maltese and an Italian search and rescue zone. And this means the state has the responsibility to either rescue themselves or to inform and organize rescue there. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is that this cooperation is just not happening anymore. So it's pretty common that civil rescue organizations are not informed by state actors, like MRCC in Rome, also if we talk about Malta. And this means that there's a lot of cases that are not known to the civil organizations, but are known to Frontex or state actors. And this quite often leads to NGOs not being informed, but at the same time, there were quite some cases where Frontex, for example, informed the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, which led to an illegal pullback of these people. So how we actually find people in distress. So there's a very, let's say, old school way to do this. And this is that once we enter the area of operations, we have lookouts. So basically there's people with binoculars. We check the radar. So this is one way to find it. We have two planes that do monitoring flights over the Mediterranean. So this is Sea-Watch planes, and they mostly document human rights violations, but they also spot boats in distress. And if they spot a boat, they inform authorities, but also rescue ships in the vicinity.
Like external factors such as weather conditions, for example, but also from our knowledge where most of the people are currently departing from, which is something we monitor through, let's see, checking the last couple of months where most of the distress cases have been spotted or have been discovered. We define our search pattern.
And the other option is there is another NGO that's called Alarm Phone, which is basically a phone number people in distress at sea can call, and they relay this information to authorities, but also to NGOs that are active in the Mediterranean.
Muchas veces estas mafias que ponen a la gente en estas embarcaciones les dan teléfonos satelitales, entonces cuando llegan a un cierto punto se comunican con Alarm Phone y ellos a través de la empresa logran triangular la posición y avisan primero a las autoridades y en copia ponen a todos los barcos que estén en la zona para asegurarse que haya una respuesta.
But also this hotline, for example, is used by relatives who maybe know about family members who are currently doing the crossing.
Automáticamente que recibimos la información, ponemos rumbo para allí, tenemos unas lanchas rápidas que están más preparadas para navegar lejos, entonces cuando ya estamos a una distancia de unos 50 kilómetros más o menos, lanzamos las lanchas van equipadas con una tripulación de 4 personas, 2 rescatadores, 2 socorristas, un patrón y un periodista que registra todo lo que sucede. Aparte llevan los chalecos necesarios. Una vez que llegan, hacen la evaluación, nos comunicamos o por VHF o por teléfono satelital para saber cómo está la situación y bueno, mientras el barco va llegando, verifican la estabilidad del bote en peligro, si es necesario embarcan algunas personas para quitarle carga, pues siempre están sobrecargados. Y una vez que llega el barco, empezamos a hacer la asistencia. Todo esto en simultáneo se va avisando a las autoridades, se va solicitando la coordinación de los centros de rescate que correspondan, ¿no? Por ejemplo, ahora estamos en zona SAR maltesa. La competencia de coordinar un caso de rescate aquí es de las autoridades maltesas, pero también se pone en copia a las autoridades italianas porque son la zona contigua, ¿no?, de quien tendría que responder por competencias. Empieza un triaje en donde se diferencian si hay algún caso médico urgente. Muchas veces la gente, por ejemplo, tiene quemaduras por gasolina, entonces, si bien nos asiste en ese momento exacto, ya se identifica, tenemos un conteo de toda la gente que tenemos a bordo, cuántas mujeres, cuántos niños, cuántos menores, si hay casos médicos que luego tenemos que ir evaluando, y vamos solicitando la coordinación y la asignación de un post, de un place of safety, que es el puerto seguro más cercano, ¿no?
We are highly depending on Italy when it comes to the assignment of a safe port after a rescue. Because by international law, states are obliged to provide rescue ships with the closest port of safety. And in our case, so where we operate, Libya is not a port of safety. Tunisia cannot be a port of safety in the current situation. This only leaves Malta and Italy as closest ports, closest safe ports. And Malta is basically not reacting at all. Malta is not rescuing. Malta basically said goodbye to human rights a long while ago. So this only leaves Italy. Italy is relatively fast assigning these safe ports after a first rescue. This can even be while you're still in the rescue situation, because we communicate everything transparently to the rescue and coordination centers, also in Rome. And this means that they basically assign you a port right away, which is a huge difference to a couple of years ago when Salvini was still Minister of Interior in Italy, where sometimes it took weeks to actually have a port, where we had these standoffs where people were basically kept hostage at sea by Italy because they were not allowed ships to disembark people in Italy or enter a port. Now this changed, but at the same time, whilst they assign a port of safety relatively fast, these ports are very far away. So they're pretty much up in the north. So this could be Genoa, could also be even more far away. And this means that the rescue ships have to take a very long journey, which is super stressful for the people that are rescued on board. But it also costs a lot of time, because this means you have to go 4 days in one direction, have to do the disembarkation, and then go back for another 4 days, which basically costs you 8 days of rescuing. Whilst at the same time, it would be super easy for Italy to assign a port that it's way closer, that would only cost us 2 days. So this is, from our perspective, clearly politically motivated, also because we know of a couple of cases where we brought people up in the north, traveling there with the ship for 4 days, and then they were put into buses and brought back to the south.
The Italian authorities usually assigning us distant ports far away, such as, for example, Ravenna, to give you an example. This is often more than 1,600 kilometers away from the area of operation.
También el coste operativo para una ONG, que al final subsiste con donaciones y principalmente de esto, ¿no? Cada día de navegación son, por lo menos para nosotros en el Open Air, son unos 3.000 litros de combustible. Son 6 para ir, 6 para volver, son 12 días más.
And that also means that we have to travel for several days for no reason, basically. And that keeps us away from the area of operation where we are needed, because we could rescue more people from the stress and prevent more deaths at sea if we could disembark people earlier, or disembark people in a closer port and then return earlier back to the area of operation, for sure.
There's a lot of criminalization. There's a lot of ships being blocked, especially by Italy, before that also by Malta. So what we've seen in the last years is that Italy implemented a new law. It's called the Piantedosi Decree, which basically means that, amongst other things, that a rescue ship, a civil rescue ship, that's a main difference, obviously, a civil rescue ship is obliged to leave the area of operation after an initial rescue. So this means if there's other cases open and you are basically told to leave the area, this is nothing else than a call to let people drown. And this is obviously not at all aligned with international law. There is a duty to rescue for everyone at sea. And at the same time, it's also international waters where Italy does not have jurisdiction. If, for example, we do not comply with these new regulations with the Piantedosi decree and not abort our rescue operations after an initial rescue, this means we will be punished for this. And this means, for once, we have to pay a fine, but more importantly, the ship will be blocked. And the law is designed in a way that you basically have 3 strikes and you're out. So this means if you break the decree the first time, you get a fine and your ship is blocked. The second time, you get another block and another fine. And the third time, the ship is confiscated and will be gone for good.
Arbitrary detentions on search and rescue vessels has happened frequently in the past 2 years. But we are always going in front of court against these action, against these arbitrary detentions. And in most of the cases, we also get success in front of the court against these detentions because they are simply unlawful and arbitrary.
Tú te desvías del rumbo al que es el puerto o disminuyes la velocidad, puede interpretarse como una falta a esta legislación y esto se traduce a multas de 10.000 euros o más y detenciones de 20 días.
Search and rescue in the Central Mediterranean Sea is not at all a crime, but simply a moral and legal issue. The vast majority of the area in the Central Mediterranean Sea where we're operating is in fact international waters. And there is a difference between territorial waters and a search and rescue region where states have a responsibility to act.
Hasta el 2018 Italia tenía desplegados un montón de medios de barcos de rescate grandes, más pequeños. Había una operación europea que, bueno, desplegaba buques incluso de la Armada Española. Y eso fue cambiando porque la política a nivel europeo fue externalizar la frontera y no se está pensando como un operativo lo más eficiente posible para rescatar a todas las personas que puedan estar en peligro aquí.
We are operating there, especially since European state actors have fully withdrawn from search and rescue in this area, despite it would be their responsibility to take over search and rescue activities. But at the moment, there is nobody in this central area apart from civil actors, at least not at sea. We know that, for example, the Italian Coast Guard is taking over their responsibilities within the Italian search and rescue region, but this is only a very, very, very small part of this of the whole area of operation. And outside of this area of the Italian search and rescue region, there is no European state actor taking over any responsibility and any coordination. A lot of distress cases we observe and we monitor are in Maltese search and rescue region, where, for example, Malta would have the responsibility to act and to launch a search and rescue operation, or to at least coordinate the search and rescue operation. However, they usually fail to act. And if they act, they do not coordinate or call vessels or actors who have the possibilities and the means to rescue people and bring them to a safe port. But they are in contact with the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, who goes outside of their assigned region and illegally intercepts people and brings them back to Libya. A rescue only terminates once the people rescued are actually disembarking in a safe place. And those people who are getting picked up by the so-called Libyan process, they will never get to disembark in a safe place. They will always get brought back to Libya. So actually, the Libyan Coast Guard is not an actor that can perform a rescue in the sense of maritime law. And that also has been acknowledged by courts. So there has been a ruling by the Crotone Court, for example, in the last year, which called the so-called Libyan Coast Guard an illegitimate actor in terms of search and rescue in the Mediterranean Sea.
Libia no tiene las garantías para que la gente que está escapando, grupos vulnerables, tengan su seguridad. Asegurar que estas personas no van a estar expuestas nuevamente a, bueno, los grupos de los que escapan o que los ponen en peligro.
Libya and Tunisia really is a black box. Like, nobody really can go there. Even for a lot of European actors, it's very, very hard to understand how the situation on the ground, especially in Libya, is. Libya is a war zone. There is a civil war going on. There are different militias operating in different regions. Militias in the different regions have different, connections to smugglers, to traffickers who are facilitating crossings. But at the same time, those militias are very, very much entangled with also the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, which is an actor that is directly financed and supported by the European Union.
The European Union actively takes part in human rights violations because we look at the so-called Libyan Coast Guard. This is basically a couple of militias that were turned into a Coast Guard with the help of the European Union, trained by the European Union, financed by the European Union. And the only task they have is to basically intercept people at sea and pull them back illegally, because this is a breach of the non-refoulement principle. So it's a breach of international law. And this is something that the European Union cannot do itself. So they need basically others to do the dirty work.
And this is outrageous, because the European Union is saying a lot of times that they are actually trying to fight smuggling, to combat smuggling, to trying to reduce the numbers. But with who they are financing, they are paying into a vicious circle of violence and of people taking at sea and people risking their lives. This is what we hear from reports from people we rescued, that, for example, they get intercepted after an unsuccessful attempt to cross the Mediterranean Sea. They get intercepted by the so-called Libyan Coast Guard. They're getting violently intercepted. They're getting forcibly pulled back and put into detention centers. And those people are the same people who then again facilitate the next attempt for them to cross the central Mediterranean Sea. It's necessary to understand that this crossing, not only the crossing, but the whole journey people are going through, is an intense journey, is a super dangerous journey. And it is a journey that often takes years. Once we rescue people, they have been through a lot of human rights violations, but also a lot of, like, thousands of kilometers often they had to travel under terrible conditions, and often witnessing death on their route, or being exposed to torture in countries such as Libya or Tunisia, being exploited, not having been treated with any kind of dignity or humanity. Again and again, shocking to hear of people who have been trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea several times, 4, 5, 6, 7 attempts that often took them to actually make it. They have lost people they know, they have lost family members often. They have been forcibly intercepted and brought back to Libya many times against their will. You must again take over their duty to rescue people at sea, and to organize a state-led search and rescue program in the central Mediterranean Sea, so that it is not up to the civil society to organize that people are not drowning while fleeing from super dangerous situations. Because we think it is a moral duty, but also it is obviously a legal duty as a vessel in the area who has knowledge of a distress case to render assistance to the people. This is nothing we made up. This is something that is simply enforced in or enshrined in international maritime law.
Hi, I'm Claudia, and I work with the Border Violence Monitoring Network. BVMN is a network of 14 different organizations based in different countries in Europe that is committed to monitoring human rights violations at European borders and advocating against them. So for that reason, we were born in 2017 and started collecting testimonies of firsthand experiences with people on the move who had experienced border violence in different parts of Europe. So we started monitoring violence mainly in the Balkan region and Greece. But at the moment, we've also expanded the geographic scope to include France, Poland, Austria. So the Balkan route mainly includes the transit countries that people try to cross when coming from Turkey, mainly into Greece and Bulgaria, either by the land borders or the sea, to then cross through Bulgaria, I said, Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, sometimes Hungary, or more towards the west, through Slovenia, Italy, Austria. At the moment, we're also seeing that more and more people are crossing more from the south of the Western Balkans, so including Albania, and Montenegro, places that before were NSAT's transit countries. But yeah, also North Macedonia, so this whole area. As for the nationalities, it varies a lot. Something that we have witnessed for sure, as many other organizations have, is that since the toppling of the Assad's regime last year, the number of Syrian people trying to come has also been reduced. However, on the other hand of that, we've also seen that more and more Syrian people have been forced into coming back through so-called voluntary return schemes, and subject to intimidation as well, to kind of encourage coming back to Syria. Obviously, we can see the effects of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan as well. That's obviously way longer ago in 2021, which has also affected the nationalities of the people coming. I would say mainly young men for sure, but I think it's because routes are made harder and harder that other people, such as families or minors or women, find it harder to arrive. I think it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that the rhetoric kind of tells only young men are coming who are not real refugees, or that's how they're constructed. Therefore, we have to improve surveillance, security, and policing, fencing, and that kind of like makes other more vulnerable people more unable to come. For sure, there are still families arriving at all of these different countries. There are families and minors being detained. Generally, like the violence that is perpetrated at the violence doesn't really exclude minors and other vulnerable people. We recently recorded several testimonies outlining violence perpetrated by Croatian police during pushbacks against minors. That includes physical and psychological violence with minors as young as 2 years old. So there are families for sure, and the families experience the same type of violence. It's just that routes are made so hard that for sure generally it's younger men that are encountered in those places. Pushbacks for sure have been kind of like a key element of the European migration regime for the past several years. However, we're also seeing an increase in the violence that happens within the countries themselves. You mentioned human trafficking, which is for sure a threat to people on the move for transit in these countries. We're also seeing that there's local protection mechanisms that exist in the different, for example, reception centers do not take this into account, and that several organizations from the Border Violence Monitoring Network as well have made it clear that these mechanisms do not protect survivors of human trafficking, that they're not adapted to take care of those vulnerabilities and identify them, so that the current migration regime in Europe also kind of enables that violence as well. Apart from that, we're seeing that within the countries themselves, people are increasingly put in arbitrary detention for longer periods of time, and that in those detention conditions, they often report inhumane and degrading treatment, completely unhygienic conditions, lack of information, and access to legal counsel. So we're seeing that apart from the violence that happens exactly at the borders, like those expulsions, there are increasingly more raiding, more detention, and more deterrence policies and violence within the countries and within the cities themselves that make it difficult for people to not just transit, but take shelter or live in some of these countries. I think generally the perspective of the countries and of the governments is very hostile towards these claims because they involve these governments, right? I think like it is very clear that the violence is coming directly from the state, and therefore that the state doesn't want to do much to change it. And that's from the national governments themselves, but also from the European Union itself, which kind of, I would say, facilitates and enables this violence through two main means, or maybe three. One of them is not pursuing and not kind of prosecuting this wide evidence that exists about these violent practices. Another one would be through funding. So most of the fences, most of the drones, most of the technology that is also now deployed at the borders has some sort of EU funding behind it. That's from the Turkey-Iran border, which has a fence been built also using EU funding, to the technology that is used, for example, at the Greek borders as well. But we also have Frontex coming into several of these countries. In the past 2 years, we've seen an expansion of Frontex missions in most countries in the Western Balkans. I think Bosnia-Herzegovina was the last country that didn't have a specific agreement with Frontex, and that was finalized in it this year. But so far, I think all of the countries in the region have had an agreement for years, but that in the past 2 years, that agreement has been expanded to include more functions, more areas of deployment for Frontex. And what we have seen by the evidence collected by different organizations and investigative reporting in the past years as well is that the presence of Frontex does really nothing to avoid these human rights violations from happening, but rather makes the EU complicit in them with their presence. And I think the latest one has been all of the evidence that Frontex has been present in many pushbacks perpetrated in Greece, for example, without suspending the agreement with them despite all of the evidence.
Hello, my name is Piotr, and I work at We Are Monitoring Association, which is a part of Border Violence Monitoring Network, and it's also a part of Grupa Granica, which is a coalition providing humanitarian aid, monitoring human rights violation, and supporting access to legal assistance for people on the move at the Polish Belarus border. So the situation is very difficult, especially today because of the suspended apply for asylum that the government introduced recently. The violation are the lack of access to basic necessities such as food, water, and medical system, but the most common is the violence and the pushbacks. The situation changed because now the pushbacks are more common, and even applying for international protection doesn't mean that the person won't be pushed back. So as we see now, even when the person applying for the international protection, they are pushbacking. Nowadays, we see a lot of countries from the Horn of Africa, and as Claudia said previously, there was less and less people from Syria. Belarus isn't a safe third country because we hear about a lot of violence and a lot of human rights violation in the forest between Belarus and Poland. And those violations and this violence comes from the border services as well. So there is a lot of danger for the people on the move and on the route also. There is a debate because actions of the Belarusian government are seen as the part of the hybrid war, especially since the war in the Ukraine began, but the human rights can't be violated because of that reason. I would love to see the better future for this route and for the people on the move, but unfortunately, from our experience, all the changes that are coming are worse and worse for the people on the move.
Common Pact on Asylum, I mean, it's basically just shows in general the direction we're going. So, I mean, we have quite an idea how migration works from the last couple of decades, more or less, and also what does not work. And the pact is basically just going pretty much in a direction that obviously hasn't worked. And I mean, it hasn't worked for the European states, but mostly it has not worked for people on the move. Because, I mean, if we look at the Mediterranean, so nothing in the pact will change anything in the situation in the Mediterranean. If we look at the situation at the borders, this is basically the situation we had a couple of years ago in Moria, which has not changed, even though the camp in Moria is not existing anymore. But we see that people have to live in camps without a perspective at the European borders. And what the pact does is basically looking at the misery we have and put this into a regulation. So this means more camps, more prisons, basically at the European borders. It's more deals that are an attempt to externalize the borders even more. And this is something that we also witness in our daily work, basically, because If we look at the Mediterranean, you see that the European Union has a ton of deals made when it comes to migration. Like on the one side, obviously with Turkey, where we operate, with Libya, with Tunisia, but then also even way further into the African continent. And this basically means the deals are 100% made to hinder people from actually reaching Europe. And this is something that will not happen in general, because people that are forced to flee will flee. And if they cannot find an easy way to flee, and usually it's definitely not easy, and it's made pretty hard by the European Union, they will try to look for another way. And what the European Union does is just making it much, much harder for people to actually reach safety. And this just leads to more and more dangerous and deadly routes.
I think the most civil society organizations for migration rights have been saying over the years that the new pact does nothing to increase the protection of people on the move trying to seek asylum in Europe. And I think it has several negative effects that we're already seeing in some of the regions. The most, I guess, the clearest of them might be an increase in the tension in general in all of the stages of the asylum procedure. So that would be, it just makes the tension easier, more accessible, more available, even though according to international law, it should be a last resort measure. And that's something that I think in order to understand it, it's very important to look at the pilot projects that are going on in Greece. I think Greece has been, in a way, for this new pact, a stage of innovation in the worst sense of the word. So it's been the place where it's this piloting of detention is being tried. And we could look at the close control access centers in the islands, for example, where people are detained for long periods of time after they arrive in the island seeking asylum. We can look at the conditions that people describe in those centers, at the violence they endure, the lack of access to rights and the lack of access to support. And we can also look at, for example, the pre-removal detention centers also in Greece, kind of showing both kind of detention present at all stages from arrival to deportation order. More recently, we have been reporting on several deaths that have been happening in the pre-removal detention centers due to the conditions, the lack of access to healthcare, and the violence happening in them, which I think really shows how this focus on detention does nothing to protect the rights and the lives of people on the move in general. And if we can judge the course of what's going to happen in other European countries by what we are already seeing in the places where this has been implemented, I think it paints a very negative picture.
A pact is dangerous, and the pact is definitely a step in the wrong way, not enforcing a state-led search and rescue program, but rather focusing on such migration pacts, which again move simply in the wrong direction from where we actually would need to move.
I think the major problem is, and this is a problem most of all of politics, it's, to be honest, partly a problem of media, is that migration is always discussed as a problem or a crisis or something that needs to be handled, while at the same time, migration is basically there since the beginning of humankind. So there was always migration, there will always be migration. Whenever a politician says they will stop migration, they're lying. So you cannot stop migration. It would also be the worst idea people ever had, because there wouldn't be civilization without migration. And I think that at some point that basically the whole public discourse went into the direction that migration is only seen as a problem that needs to be handled, and that obviously leads to a very usually right-wing, fascist, populist understanding of how to provide easy solution, which there aren't. With all the way the discourse moved, is definitely just leading to a deterioration of human rights at the borders in countries where the European Union struck deals with. This leads to a militarization of society, of language. I mean, obviously, politically, we're not going in the best direction right now, but this is not a natural catastrophe. So this is all man-made. Like, if there was the political will to change this, like, no one would have to die by tomorrow. But this is pretty much far away right now, obviously, but doesn't mean that it has to be far away in the future or that it doesn't happen. Because I mean, in the end, everything can change if people want things to change. And I think what's just important is that politics will not just change this from one day to another. Politics changes if there's enough pressure that people put on to actually change things. And I think this can happen all the time. And we see it also around the world that this happens. And there's a lot of things people can actually do. And it doesn't necessarily have to start with changing the whole migration system in the European Union, obviously, but there's a lot of stuff you can do in everyday life. And I think that's just something to keep in mind because it's also the small steps that basically build change.